Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. It is indeed a great pleasure and honor to welcome you today here in this impressive building on behalf of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Prague office. Having mentioned the great hall of this historic Czernin Palace, I would like to start my short address by expressing my sincere gratitude to our host, the Czech Foreign Ministry, for granting us the privilege to meet literally in their living room. The very hall in which on July the 1st in 1991, former President Václav Havel formally ended the 1955 Warsaw Treaty, Organization of Friendship, Cooperation, Mutual Assistance, and so disestablished the Warsaw Treaty after 36 years of military alliance with the USSR. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to wholeheartedly thank our long-standing cooperation partner, the Institute of International Relations Prague, not only for their excellent contributions and determination with regard to this event, but for their commitment and friendship over the last two decades. Thank you very much indeed. Another word of thanks goes to the distinguished experts and speakers from the Visegrad 4 countries and Germany who have traveled to Prague to present and discuss their findings and views on the question popular or populist democracy in Central Europe, which is the headline of our conference today. Before I move on to touch a few issues of today's main topic, allow me one short remark on a more personal note. The Czech Republic, as a result of the parliamentary elections in 2013, formed a new government. Within the context of personal recruitment in the newly staffed and in some cases newly shaped ministries and Prague office, the Prague office of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung lost two outstanding colleagues. One of them is taking up a top position in the Czech Foreign Ministry on Monday, a person most of you know, Kristina Laryshova, who worked for the Prague office of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for more than a decade, will now serve her country in a different responsible position. This conference today was also her inspiration, so I would like to take this opportunity to thank Kristina Laryshova for her excellent work as well, and at the same time to wish her success in her new position. Our loss, dear colleagues of the ministry, is your gain. With only 3 months to go to the election of the new European Parliament in May, political analysts all over Europe expect anonymously a new parliament in Brussels and Strasbourg, which consists by minimum margin of about 25% of extremist parties, most probably even up to 30%. 1/3 of the European Parliament occupied by parties and representatives which are described as extreme, nationalistic, intolerant, and populist. That would be a different Europe after all, or not? What do we know about these parties and movements? What are their messages? Who are their voters? Is democracy, the democracy we used to know, until now at least, at stake? We have gathered today some of the best experts in their fields to share with us their views on this controversial issue. As you can see from the program in front of you, we have divided the conference in 3 parts to keep the discussion alive and vibrant. We will have 2 keynote speakers, both of them, among other things, published interesting essays in the brand new book you find at the entrance of the building. I can only recommend to read it. Before we start the first panel, I would like to ask my dear colleague Ondřej Horký-Hlucháň, head of the research department in the Institute of International Relations, Prague, and co-organizer of this conference, to welcome you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Before I start, I would say that our director of the Institute of International Relations, Petr Kratochvíl, and the deputy director would be really happy to open this conference. But since we are an Institute of International Relations, they are both abroad, so it's my honor to be here with you today. Moreover, I would say it's another honor that we are at the Great Hall, in the Great Hall of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which shows how the topic we are dealing with today is of importance for the decision makers and people from the academia today. I would share just 2 remarks on the context we are sharing regarding to the topic of this conference. One thing is that we have 2 important dates. It will be very soon the 10th anniversary of the Eastern enlargement, and secondly, we are also approaching in less than 3 months the elections to the European Parliament. And since we have witnessed the Euro crisis and the general rise of the populist parties in the region, that is a big question how those parties will succeed in these elections. And for instance, the yesterday published poll of the Czech television on how people see the Eastern enlargement shows that actually the Czech society is really split between those who see the interest in the European Union as a positive and a negative thing. This is something that we should think about at the European level. Secondly, at the national level, just last year, to give 2 examples of populist parties succeeding. For instance, the Austrian Freedom Party being at 20% in Austria, and one thing that, especially those who live in the Czech Republic and who share a common history with Slovakia, one thing that really shocked us was the success of Marian Kotleba as a more or less neo-Nazi representative of a party who became the head of a region in Slovakia. But on the other hand, one thing that we can see here in Central Europe, but also from the recent developments in Ukraine, that very often the populist movements are a response to the low political accountability in the region of Central and Eastern Europe. And perhaps we have also tackled the problem of political accountability within the current system of political parties to understand the problem, which goes beyond the problem of the European integration, but also tackles issues such as climate change denial, or especially in this region, very important anti-Roma sentiments and anti-migration statements and stances generally. I would like to thank for organizations here. First of all, thank you very much, Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, for our long-time partner, for bringing us also those distinguished speakers we are having here today, and for all your input. We are here in this beautiful great hall of the MFA. Thank you very much, Minister of Foreign Affairs, for providing us with the facilities and other inputs and analysis and inputs in the debates during this conference. We are also very thankful to our former director. I can also say we lost one of our colleagues, who is now the first Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and who we'll have the pleasure to hear him for his keynote address at noon. And finally, on behalf of the Institute of International Relations, I'm very thankful for the more or less invisible work of our conference service and of our interns. So I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to welcome you to this conference on popular and populist democracy in Central Europe, which is held in troubled times. I'm not speaking of Central Europe, but of the eastern neighbor of Central Europe, Ukraine. We will not talk of what is happening in Kiev or on Crimea today, but I'm sure we will have to do so with the same question, popular or populist democracy, in future times. But today we will focus on the 4 Visegrad countries and on, in a comparative view, on some Western European countries as Germany or France. We have 3 distinguished speakers. The first to my right is Mrs. Tanja Binder, who has been with the Mannheim Center for European Social Research in former times. Now, as a political scientist, she's inter alia with the Wahl-O-Mat team of the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, which is the federal agency of Germany for the spread of democracy and independent political knowledge. And the Wahl-O-Mat team, perhaps she will explain what exactly this is. To her right, Mr. Bálint Magar from Budapest. He is a former member of the SDS party, the Liberal Party, a founding member in the early 1990s. And in this function, he had different government functions. Inter alia, he has been the Minister of Education, and nowadays he's one of the most distinguished critiques of the Orban government. And we will hear what he has to say about the Fidesz party and the development in Hungary since 2006 or 2010. And to my left, Kai-Olaf Lang from Berlin, who is the head of the research division on European integration at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, or German Institute for Security Affairs. And he is one of the best, most distinguished connoisseur of politics in Central and Eastern Europe in Germany. And my name is Volker Weichsel. I'm the editor of a Berlin-based journal called Osteuropa, dealing with politics, culture, society, economics in the whole region from Prague to Vladivostok, the former communist Eastern Europe, but we are still dealing with the whole region. So I think as this is the first panel, we have to do some conceptual work, and every speaker will have to ask some basic questions, such as, what exactly do we understand if we say populism? Where is the dividing line between democratic parties and populist parties? Between standard parties or non-standard parties? Is populism something established parties say about new parties? Or is there something essential about populism? Is it reasonable to talk of democratic parties on the one hand and populist on the other hand? Or is it better to distinguish between democratic, populist, and radical parties? What about left-wing and right-wing parties? Are all populist parties just populist, neither left nor right? Or does it have sense to speak of left-wing populist parties and right-wing? Is it about populism? Is it about new ideas, alternatives to democratic parties which are just technocrats? Or is it just about new jobs for new politicians? Is populism a sign of decline of democracy? Or is it rather a sign that democracy is alive? These are some questions that I hope the speakers will answer to in their statements. You have about 15 minutes, and I think 15 up to 20 at most. We say ladies first, and start with Tanja Binder.
Oh, okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad today to present here major results of my research project, in which I examined effects of right-wing populist parties, or to be more precise, how parties, established parties and governments reacted to the increasing pressure of right-wing populist parties. I investigated in 2 countries, Austria and France, and if I'm talking here and present you some more abstract thesis today because of the time limit, then this is of my results about France and Austria, but I think we can see parallels and similarities in other countries very easy. And what I found out, to be honest, is not very pleasant. Meanwhile, right-wing populist parties are a European phenomenon. The first right-wing populist parties occurred in the 1980s, and since 1990 we have as well witnessed an emergence of far-right parties and as well populist parties in Central, Eastern and Eastern European countries. Nowadays, in almost every European country, we find a right-wing populist or another far-right party which gets considerable support in elections. Most of them gained sustainable electorate, between 10 and 20% of the electorate, so that they contest the established and mainstream parties and compete for the part of a dominant player in the system. And in many countries, they have become, meanwhile, very decisive for parliamentarian majorities and are or were part of a coalition government as the Freedom Party in Austria. For the upcoming European elections, an electoral success of many right-wing populist parties is expected. Recent polls forecast, for example, for the French National Front, that it will become the strongest party at the election for the European Parliament in France. And this means that a growing part of the European parliamentarians will be skeptical or at all against the European Union and integration, and against some basic fundamentals of European democracy. These parties are a real challenge for democracy, and that not only because of their anti-European Union sentiments, but by their fundamental principles and their success to drive established parties on. So, sorry, I forgot to, now, is this? Does it work? Ah, yeah, okay. When I'm talking of right-wing populist parties, that's one of my answers to your question now. I'm talking of parties which are characterized by a strategy to gain power that appeals to the people in a twofold way. The people as a demos, the democratic sovereign, and the people as an ethnic cultural entity as the ethnos, so to say. Their primary aim is the preservation or return to an exclusive, homogeneous ethnic cultural community and a political system with a direct relationship between the governed people and their executive. Effectively, their major mobilizing issues are that they show a very strong anti-elitist effect. They channel anti-establishment effects, the dissatisfaction with the political system and elites. They accuse them of being corrupt, of following just their own or other interests, but not the interests of the people. And frequently they accuse them as well of being anti-democratic. The French National Front accused always the Gang of Four, which meant the established parties. In Austria, it was the cartel of the red and black, which was object of the critique. And as well, they call for reforms of the political system, preferably toward a direct democracy. They always mention the Swiss democracy as their ideal, with a direct elected executives with direct decision procedures. In contrast to extremist or fascist parties, they do not deny democracy completely. On the contrary, they proclaim themselves as the real apologists of democracy, and they use democratic procedures to come to power. And if they have the opportunity to, they use as well direct democratic instruments to mobilize their adherents and to influence the discourse. The Austrian Freedom Party, for example, set many popular initiatives. And what we witnessed recently in Switzerland is and which is a real general trend, the Swiss People's Party is nowadays the major initiator of referenda in Switzerland. So, the second core issue of right-wing populist parties is all issues which concern national identity and national interests. So the preservation of a national ethnic cultural identity and a sovereign nation state. Migration-related topics are those which are used intensively to draw a scenario of a threatened community or identity. They reject the acknowledgement of a multicultural society, call for immigration stops, and the return of migrants, and they deny civil, social, and political rights for migrants or permanent residents. Since 2001, they focus their critique particularly on Muslims, but as well other ethnic minorities are targets, for example, Roma people. This always depends on the national context of the countries, which minority is in the focus. The anti-immigration policies are furthermore linked to several other relevant political problems as crime, unemployment, social security. And migrants are always discriminated as those which import crime, cause increasing unemployment rates, or abuse the social system. So that anti-immigration policies is presented as a solution for all these problems by right-wing populist parties. And of course, European integration offers in all these respects a prime target. Right-wing populist parties attack the Brussels bureaucrats frequently and very sharply, that they are not acting for the people but for the interest of lobby groups. At the moment, notably, they are accused for present the interests of the financial sector. They criticize as well a lack of democracy and democratic legitimacy in the European Union and blame the European Union for manifold problems in their countries. They are against further European integration, and they are a driving force and opponents to in referendum campaigns about further steps of integration. But most of the right-wing populist parties argue that they are not fundamentally against Europe and the European cooperation, but they call for a Europe of sovereign nations. This Europe they see as a cultural and religious homogeneous space, which has to be preserved of an evasion of different cultures, notably Muslims. This is the binding element between European right-wing populist parties. But the xenophobia, does not stop at the European borders. Even within the European Union, they demonstrate their racist attitudes. They do not hesitate to form a prejudice against EU member states, as Greece, for example, or people from other European countries. At the moment, frequently, Southeastern European people are the target of racist attacks from Western right-wing populist parties. And of course, they reject the free movement of EU citizens. Indeed, the political agenda of right-wing populist parties and policies they claim for indicate already a tension relationship towards a representative democracy and the plural society of our days. Oh, sorry, I missed this. Right-wing populist parties as the Austrian Freedom Party and the French National Front, which gained over a long time period votes, had multiple effects on the political system. No, sorry, I'm too far. Okay. Yeah. Of course, they weakened established parties and changed patterns of party competition, but this is not my major concern today, which is much more of interest, particularly with regard to the European Union question. is that they gained as well influence about the political discourse as agenda setters and as protagonists of new politics. And because of their success, they provoked some reflexes and critical responses and policy adaptations of the established parties. I will come to some examples concerning the core issues of right-wing populist parties. If we look at those issues which have most mobilizing powers for them, it's worth to have a closer look on migration policy. And what we can see is that we have almost a completely negative discourse about migration, which was launched by right-wing populist parties, and meanwhile it's the mainstream discourse. The presence of migrants is almost negatively connotated. The only positive aspect of this discourse is a purely utilitaristic one, the economic use of migrants. But beside this, we find rarely mighty political and societal actors which bring in positive aspects of migration. And as well, xenophobe arguments gain ground in this discourse. For example, conservative parties as the Austrian People Party or the UMP in France adapted this issue, and they approached the positions of right-wing populist parties. But as well, social democratic parties proclaim nowadays a stricter regulation of immigration and act in a very defensive way in this policy field. Former socialist aims or social democratic aims to give permanent residents more or equal rights and to lower the hurdles to become a permanent resident, for example, or to become a full citizen, have become particularly obsolete or were neglected. So we find no influential actors which have a decisive position in the political system which still claim for a distinct alternative concept of migration, really, in contrast to the restrictive concept of the right-wing populist parties. One of the reasons is that conservative parties approach right-wing populist positions so far, and that social democratic parties have become so defensive, is that the major logic of parties they follow in this policy field is to gain votes, with policies on the expense of a minority that has no political influence. The result of this shift in the discourse and in the policy supplies is that we witnessed on national and EU level an immigration policy which is getting even more restrictive. The entrance is restrictive, regulated, and reserved to a very small part, high qualified people, temporary labor force, or very small group of refugees and asylum seekers. But as well, migrant policy changed. The civil and social and political rights have been cut over the last 2 decades, and the conditions to become a full citizen of a community with equal rights have been aggravated. This trend toward a furthermore restrictive and exclusionary migration policy can be observed in France, particularly under conservative majorities, and as well in Austria, but here as well under the Grand Coalition, but furthermore under the coalition of the People Party and the Freedom Party. I will leave out now the references to European Union. Sorry. I will come to the next point. But the last word to this migration policy is indeed that if migration policy is becoming more and more exclusionary then the democratic principle of equality and inclusion is going to be damaged or threatened. For example, Wolfgang Merkel calls this an exclusive democracy. I don't say that we are already reached this point, but the countries are on the road towards it. Another core field of right-wing populists is to exploit and profile with establishment sentiments and demands for direct democracy. And as well here we can observe that the discourse about the political system, about democratic political institutions, political parties and elites has become more and more negative. The major elements of representative democracy, particularly parliaments and parties, are under permanent suspicion and the distrust is growing. And this concerns national and even more European politics. The way established parties reacted to the right-wing populist anti-elitist effects and the demands for direct democracy is not very convincing and highly problematic for democracy, because particularly governing parties tend to hold on the status quo. Parties in opposition frequently picked up right-wing populist demands for direct democracy and called for reforms of the electoral systems or direct democratic decision procedures, but once in power, they are acting differently. Frequently, reforms got stuck, even when before a majority for reform was on the horizon, or reforms do not fulfill the promises, and modes of direct participation are introduced which never come into effect because of high hurdles, as for example, the recent introduced referendum initiative in France. But even worse is that reforms of direct decision-making processes are frequently instrumentalized by those who keep the decisive majority. They abuse these democratic procedures to conserve the power of the governing majority or to concentrate power, particularly in favor of the executives or governing majorities, to keep new competitors as right-wing populist parties away from power. This trend is stronger in France, where majoritarian rules and culture allow much easier changes of political institutions, while in Austria still a political culture of consent limits the scope of action and leads more often to ineffective or non-decisions. Nevertheless, the growing governing majorities in both countries followed shortcoming interests to preserve their power, and indeed as well right-wing populist parties, as the Freedom Party, do when they come to power following the same logic, so that they are in a way disenchanted and unmasked for their over-promising. The Freedom Party in Austria had shown this very well, that their politicians are in the same way prone to corruption and that they set their personal interests and interests of power first. That this is very disappointing, particularly for voters, that they see that the ones who promised big reforms will not do very much, is clear. So, to sum it up, what happened to democracies when the pressure of right-wing populist parties increased, and by the way how established parties and governments reacted, is that the acceptance of right-wing populist issues and aims is growing. Second, the democracies tend to become more exclusive. The democratic institutions are instrumentalized to preserve power, and we can observe something I would call a cartelization of politics. This means in the end that the growing responsiveness of governing parties when they adapt issues of new competitors is paid by a very high price. It is paid by an increasing lack of responsibility and accountability. These are my results. It's not very optimistic, but I hope in the last time I had the impression that some of the parties have seen that it's not very helpful only to follow the ideas of a new competitor. But these signs are very young, and we have to see what comes out in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanja Binder. Before we will proceed with Mr. Magyar, I've got 3 questions. The first is, you said the success of right-wing popular parties started in the 1980s, but these parties existed right before 1980. How do you explain the success in recent 35 years?
Okay, the parties I'm talking about are indeed not these old-fashioned far-right parties. It's really, I think, a new phenomenon which started in the 1980s, when these parties, they dropped a bit of some of the parties which were longer existing before they dropped a bit of their ideological ballast, let's say, and they started to accept democratic procedures to gain power, and they have this concrete combination of, on the one side, they have this anti-elitist effect, and on the other side, they appeal to a people as a national or ethnic cultural community. And indeed, the first started in the 1980s, but the real successful period was in the 1990s. And I think there was a correspondence to the opening in the 1990s. The economic sector opened. The integration, the European integration was going on. And yes, of course, the impression of a globalizing world has made it much more attractive to come back to a much more restricted community. And so this is maybe one reason why they have become so successful in this time, because they took up fears of people, of a growing pressure because of this internationalization and globalization, and dissatisfaction of the political system, of course.
Okay, I think we will come back to this point with the other speakers. The second question is, you were talking of an exclusive democracy, citing Wolfgang Merkel. What exactly do you mean by exclusive? Who is excluded? Residents without citizenship? Or citizens with the wrong color? Or just new migrants who want to become residents and further on citizens?
Excluded are, in my point of view, it's, we can talk of an exclusive democracy if it's very, very restricted to get full citizens' rights. Even if you are a long-term resident, and then it has become harder to get a citizen with full rights. In Austria, it was like this because they the time period to have to be a permanent resident is very long to get citizenship. Then the conditions you have to fulfill were always tightened, yeah? And this is different in France, of course, because the system started from another point, yeah? It was much more open to integrate permanent residents into the citizenry. But in both countries we can observe that the conditions are tightened to get a full citizen. And an exclusive democracy for me is if really the possibilities to come to this point for a permanent resident, or for example for born children in this country, which never lived everywhere else. And even then it's hard to come to a citizenship. Then I would say this democracy is on the way to become an exclusive democracy. You need the chance to become citizen. The system must offer the chance to become citizen.
Well, my impression is that at least in Germany and even in France, the policies have become more inclusive, so it's easier to get citizen, but it's harder to become socially included. So in France we have millions of migrants who have the French citizenship, but they are outside the social system. And in Germany too, we have more citizens who are former migrants, second-generation migrants who are now citizens of Germany. But the social exclusion and the feeling of being a German, that is what has changed. We will discuss this later. The third question is, you said, when established parties are becoming more and more responsive to the issues of right-wing populist parties, they lose responsibility and accountability. Can you explain this?
Yes, of course. This is a very short sentence for a very complex phenomenon, because that the responsiveness is threatened. No, not responsibility, sorry. The responsibility, I talk of the responsibility of democratic actors toward the democratic system. So, and this is damaged when parties use democratic institutions simply to preserve power. The accountability is damaged when they are acting that they try to concentrate the power. The more you concentrate power, the less control you have, the less democratic control, and then accountability, which is a very necessary process in a mass democracy, in a parliamentary democracy, then this accountability is threatened, and a democratic control between the institutions is not given that much.
Okay, we will come back to all these issues in the discussion, but now the floor is yours, Mr. Magyar.
Thank you very much, Volker. Thank you very much, Volker. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I am waiting for my presentation. Yes, is there? After the collapse of the Soviet Empire, many of us lived under the illusion that communist dictatorships were going to be replaced by liberal democracies. Although the road ahead appeared to be bumpy, there was consensus that we were going through a process of a linear progression. Deviances from the norms of liberal democracies seem to be children's diseases rather than characteristics of adulthood. However, the chronic symptoms of such deviances caused analysts to interpret the political processes of certain post-communist states and describe their systems which got stalled and even turned back on the road along the liberal democracy versus autocracy axis. There was disagreement amongst transitologists, however, as to the extent post-communist countries differed from one another in terms of deviation from liberal democracies. They sometimes added an adjective to restrict the meaning of democracy, such as illiberal, directed, or pseudo, along different institutional indicators. Others characterized the systems as variants of autocracy by using softening labels such as semi-autocratic, soft dictatorship, or electoral authoritarianism. Still others attached the label hybrid to denote such systems. When reference was made to the subject of the regime and phrase of majority democracy or dominant party system was used, when the concept of power concentration, come wealth accumulation was mentioned, clientelist regime, crony capitalism, or post-accession hooliganism, were the terms suited to stress the illegitimate beneficiaries of power. Perceiving the conceptual framework of deviations, Hungarian analysts searched for historical analogies. The process of centralization and nationalization were suggestive of the soft communist stages of the Kadar regime until 1989. The reincarnation of the ideology, cultural models, and language of the Horthy regime between the two world wars gave way to fascist and corporative interpretations, whereas the loss of personal integrity in administration and governments was reminiscent of feudal systems. After 2010, Fidesz annihilated the system of liberal democracy and created an entirely new system. In his speech at Köcse before the 2010 election, Orbán declared that he would not simply change the government, but create a new model of governance, which would be completely different from the messy period of the past 2 decades. This new model was based on an ideology of national war of independence. The regime was called the system of national cooperation, and true to his promise, he established the system as a central field of power. Meanwhile, his critics from the opposition got stuck in a paradigm of mere government criticism instead of finding conceptual framework capable of interpreting this novel type of a political predator. Hungary is a Trojan horse within the EU, which represents a regime which exists outside of the EU and flourishing on the ruins of the former Soviet empire. The mafia state, the organized criminal overworld, is far removed from the world of anomalies of party funding and the organized underworld's attempts to influence political decisions. The relationships have now been reversed. It is no longer the case that private wealth is acquired to help a party's need for financial support to be gained from illegitimate sources. Rather, a political party's decision-making potential is used here to requisition private property. It is no longer the case that a hidden underworld seeks to corrupt decision-making processes. Rather, inherently purposeful, illegitimate special interests are aligned here with legislative measures and governance. There are hardly any areas where activities of the government would not be subject to power and wealth accumulation considerations of the adopted political family. The mafia state is a privatized form of a parasite state. The epithet post-communist not merely refers to a historical period, but also that it came into being from the carcass of communist dictatorship, what was characterized by the state monopoly of ownership. The designation mafia state is by no means emotional or journalistic in nature, but rather refers to the new political elite's organizational nature. The mafia state differs greatly from the various analogies referred to in elites in authoritarian regimes. Above all, that it is made up of, as is usual in the mafia, joint businesses founded principally by the family, as well as by sworn adopted political family members through the family's network of relationships. The organization kinship and loyalty are connected by threads linking ever more families, which radiate from the family patriarch in strongly hierarchical divisions of pyramid-like order of obedience. The traditional mafia, the organized criminal underworld, is no more than a violent, illegitimate attempt by a head of the pre-modern patriarchal family to exercise its power of enforcement within a society based on the equal rights of citizens and the rule of law. An attempt that the state's public authority agencies are attempting to thwart. The mafia is an adopted family in which relatives without any blood ties make a strict and solemn commitment to provide unconditional mutual assistance to all parties. The mafia is an illegitimate neo-archaism. In the mafia state, in the organized criminal overworld, the patriarch's power of enforcement works at the national level under the disguise of the institutions of democracy by occupying state power and acquiring the tools to achieve it. It can be considered as a kind of political enterprise. For the head of the adopted political family, reigning in terms of patterns of leadership, the patriarchal family, the home, one's estate, one's country are isomorphic concepts. The same culture follows the same pattern for the exercise of power at each level. The nation is his household's members, just like the patriarch who once had the right to decide in personal and wealth-related matters, as well as in any issue concerning the individual roles and competencies of his household. This new type of patriarch reigns supreme in a country where the nation becomes his household. He does not expropriate, he merely disposes. It is his due to serve justice according to status and alleged merit. And now let's shortly summarize in 12 points the distinctive characteristics of the mafia state as a subtype of autocracy. First, the concentration of political power and the accumulation of personal wealth occur in unison. Second, the alternation of political elites' systematic replacement takes place in parallel with that of the economic elite, driving such change not with the instruments of democracy and market economy. This elite replacement is centrally organized into a hierarchy dependent on the adopted political family. This cannot be called a traditional form of primitive accumulation of capital, because herein there is no flow of capital between the pre-modern and modern sectors or between the agrarian and industrial sectors accompanied by a change of ownership. What happens is merely the implementation of the change of owners of accumulated capital. Due to their socialization, however, the new body of owners do not become real entrepreneurs, but merely tax collectors in an entrepreneurial disguise, fortified by the head of the adopted political family with political monopolies. Third, it is not incidental that public interest is subverted to private interest. It occurs systematically and relentlessly. Public policy objectives, such as the motives for policy decisions, remain in the background, unaccounted for. Decisions are tainted with power and wealth motivations. Every decision concerns power and wealth at the same time, brainwash and money laundering. Fourth, the organized underworld's illegal physical coercion, characteristic of the mafia, is replaced by legalized public authority-sponsored coercion. The intention of this is to serve not only to maintain power, but also to further extend the wealth of the adopted political family. Fifth, with the legalized instruments of state monopoly of coercion, the mafia state coercively extracts personal fortunes, sometimes indirectly through transit nationalization, to serve its own interests, and redistributes this amongst the adopted political family members. In this respect, too, such corruption differs from the established forms of corruption, in which merely the illegitimate diversion of revenues takes place. Just as private banditry is abolished by the classical mafia, the mafia state eliminates individual and anarchic forms of corruption, and replaces them with the ransom levied from above in a centralized and largely legalized form. 6. The personal wealth resulting from the accumulation of political power of the adopted political family's fortune and public state property inevitably overlap with each other. This is in contrast to, for example, constitutional monarchies, where the two are clearly distinct from one another. 7. Who are the key players of the authoritarian mafia state? First is the oligarch, who is someone who uses legitimate political power to secure illegitimate economic wealth. Their political power is visible, whilst economic power remains hidden. The second key player is the oligarch, who is someone who, from legitimate economic wealth, builds political power for themselves. Their economic power is visible, whilst the political power, if any, remains hidden. And third, which is also really important, the strawman, who is someone who has no real power, whether in politics or in the economic sphere. In the gap between the legitimate and illegitimate spheres, they are formally serve as go-between for the public. In fact, the majority of those in different posts of governance are strawmen, and so are those in the economic sphere, especially if they are dependent on the state. 8th point. Decisions are taken outside the competence of formalized and legitimate organizations. It is not the model of the Communist Party's so-called Politburo, but Politburo run by the adopted political family. You know, the phrase polyp is the Hungarian equivalent for octopus, therefore we can use these play words. Instead of Politburo, we had a Politburo. However, the Politburo does not possess the legitimacy demanded by the nature of its operation. It is not the party, Fidesz, that has a transmission belt to enforce its decisions, what the Communist Party and the old regimes had with the trade unions and other pseudo-civic organizations, but it is the party itself that has become the major transmission belt of the adopted political family of the mafia state. 9th, in place of the class structures, a patron-client chain of vassal relationships comes into being. The adopted political family is built around the patriarch, the head of the family. It is centralized and hierarchically made up of personal and family relationships structured in an authoritarian formation. Under the protection of institutional guarantees, a strong democratic society with a wide range of weak ties is replaced alongside the abolition of institutional guarantees by a weak society with limited but strong personal ties. There is no free entry into the adopted political family. One may enter only if accepted, admitted, or ready to give up on one's integrity. Nor is there a free exit from the adopted political family. One may only be expelled. 10th, formalized and legal procedures give way to material and arbitrary actions. The head of the government does not govern, but illegitimately disposes of the country as if he owned it. State institutions, including the parliament, the government, the tax office, the chief prosecutor's office, do no more than rubber stamp and do the bookkeeping. The rule of law is replaced by the law of rule. Proper jurisdiction is replaced by an arbitrary practice of justice. 11th point. The top-down destruction of bureaucracy, a la Max Weber, implies the takeover of the leading positions of the administration by party commissars, who they are loyal not to the party, but to the head of the adopted political family directly or through personal links. These commissars play various roles in the legitimate spheres of bureaucracy: strawmen, governors, commissars, supervisors, cashiers, etc., labels that give a more precise sociological definition of their actual functions than of the official designation of management positions. And finally, the 12th point, this new form of vassal dependency should not be called feudal because the sociological nature of power and its legal formal legitimacy do not converge, do not overlap each other. The gap between them is bridged by state coercion and hypocrisy. The mafia state is compelled to bridge the gap between the sociological nature and legitimacy of autocratic rule with quasi-democratic procedures by restricting civil rights and electoral democracy. It is neither a liberal democracy nor a dictatorship based purely on coercion. In the wake of massive and aggressive transformation of wealth structure, the expenses incurred by the power restructuring of the mafia state impose a heavy strain on the economy, and at a time of crisis, the mafia state resembles an oil dictatorship without oil revenues. New sources are needed to generate revenues that reinforce the power and wealth of the adopted political family. These include flat rate tax, reduction of social expenditure, ransom levied on banks and public utility providers, and above all, channeling European Union resources into the coffers of the adopted political family. This, in some sense, is an economic pyramid scheme because there are 3 losers per 1 winner. It is moot point how long taxpayers of West Europe are willing to directly finance the enrichment of the Hungarian mafia, the adopted political family. However, in addition to the economic pyramid scheme, there is a political pyramid scheme as well, which in foreign policy may be characterized as a strategy of drifting in a Western boat propelled by an Eastern wind. The policy that runs the face of our European Union and transatlantic commitments goes hand in hand with begging for alms in terms of legitimacy and finances at autocrats in the East. In domestic policy, some form of cold civil war and the subjection of citizens are underway. Alternate periods of mobilization and demobilization under the slogan of National War of Independence are part of an ideological pyramid scheme which serves as a tool of suspending legal justice and moral. The nationalism of the mafia state is not targeted at other nations, but rather the expulsion of all from their own nation who are not part of the adopted political family or not built into the order of Wesel. The Hungarian octopus creates a collectivist nationalistic ideology under the pretext of so-called national and social justice, which is just a tool to justify their aspirations for concentrating power and wealth. Short assets, the losers are offered a feeling of belonging as well as the right to pass positive and negative judgments, the right to cherish true patriotism on the one hand, and to contempt the enemies, aliens and traitors, and parasites, gypsies, homeless, jobless, on the other hand. Whereas the leaders of Fidesz are not anti-Semites, their target is not the so-called Jew, but they pander to anti-Semites. They hate the bank sector, not because it's run by, in quotation, by the Jew, but rather because it's not theirs. Nor are they racist, but their target audience is. However, it is their unexcusable sin that they have legitimized feelings of anti-Semitism and racism as well as allowed to use the language that expresses such feelings. In a campaign to reach out to extremist voters, they reproduce them in an expanded numbers and occasionally build the representatives of radical right-wing ideology into the state institutions. One wonders if the escalation of this economic, political, and ideological pyramid scheme can be curbed, and what tragedy may befall the society should the pyramid implode one day. This being the case, it blogs the mind that the main dilemma of the opposition, the political opposition, still is whether to regard Viktor Orban's reign as a legitimate government or an illegitimate system. Although the manipulative and one-sided transformation of the election law urged the coalition of the democratic political parties to unite, but this unity exists only in a technical sense. They are still between the devil and the deep blue sea. Should they be the opposition of only the government or rather the whole system? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Magyar, for this very sound description of the Hungarian political system. My question is there any relationship between our debate on popular or populist democracy and that what you have said? Or has Hungary left the orbit of the European Union, of Central Europe, so we just have to discuss about a phenomenon that doesn't exist in the other states?
Yes. Hungary is a Trojan horse within the EU, which means that this system, what is built up now, it resembles the most to the systems of old Soviet republics, former Soviet republics like such as Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and a lot of extent to Putin's Russia. Which means that, this is an end of such policies where competing political forces speaking the language of populism, and after it, Hungary as a prototype within the EU, it means that it's not anymore political rotation of different, let us say, more or less populist forces in power, but it is a central field when it reaches the position, when it can stabilize this position without, practically without the possibility changing the government.
Okay, let's hear what Kai-Olaf Lang has to say on this point and on other points.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and my gratitude also goes to the organizers. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about this thrilling and important issue. After bleak and black impressions, I'm not tempted to sketch out the situation in a very positive notes, but I would like to picture the situation a little bit more in highlighting the shades of gray we have in talking about populism, and returning to what the chair at the very beginning asked, and I think it was a very important question: what do we understand by populism? Everyone has its own definition, and I think I would like to tell you what I mean by talking about populism, which is a notion I dislike increasingly, but I have not found a better one. But I think there are three key tenets for me which mark populism. The first element is so-called populist groups work according to the principle of simplification. Simplification very often is, no doubt, under-complex to develop a solution, but it's highly efficient on the electoral market. The second element of populism is, and I would be a little bit broader than Tanja, an anti-status quo posture of the leaders and parties. And this has, I think, a more ambitious and a more limited range. The more limited range one is mainly against the existing elites, being based on an appeal which is based on an us-them dichotomy. The more principle, the more profound appeal of populists is anti-system, which also means not all of the populist groups are anti-system, and not all of them, I would say, are radical, on the contrary. But most of them promise a sort of rupture, of a break with what we have. And then there is, I think, a third important element, and of course there are at least two schools in the discussion about populism, saying populism has not a real hard core of content, of substance. So in my opinion, populism is not merely a style, but rather a method which can be combined with various issues. And this is, of course, a comparative advantage, because it makes populist groups and leaders more versatile than others. What comes to my mind in this context is, for example, the FPÖ in Austria, which, and Tanja has depicted that, has this traditional anti-immigrant stance, but with shifting the focus on Muslim immigration, the Serbian communities in Austria are an interesting ally for the FPÖ. We have other cases of this kind of this flexibility, the normalisation of Front National, for example. So I think these are three important elements of populism, and like them or not, I believe that populism, which for me is not a political label but an analytical category, populists can be an important positive corrective for the political landscape and the political discourse and the political process in a given country. Because very often we have the situation that issues are neglected by the mainstream parties, and it's these groups which very often in a not very elegant way, but however, bring these issues back on the table. So, to be blunt, I'm very grateful to Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland and also to Viktor Orban in Hungary that they tabled the question of corruption in their countries, even though the solutions they offer are not completely convincing because they're monothematic and one-dimensional. However, it was one of the big failures of the years before that this core issue has not been tackled by the elites. So maybe it would be better to talk about challenging and contesting parties, or even about unconventional parties than about populist parties. But in our sober analytical round, we can use it as an analytical category. Three things I would like to talk about, basically. The first one is, and I will look, of course, at Central Eastern Europe and the countries which joined the Union in 2004-2007. The first thing is, what are the drivers behind the rise of challenging parties in this part of Europe? What are the reasons? Secondly, who are the voters? Which parts of societies are attracted by the populist appeal? And third, what is the offer? What is the supply side? So what kind of political projects or so-called solution do these groups develop? On the reasons, with the benefit of hindsight and what has happened after 1989, 2004, I would like to highlight four aspects which seem to me relevant, and which also has something to do with the interpretations and the readings of the rise of populism. The first one is populism in Central Eastern Europe a result of socio-economic hardships and the transformation catalyzed in the most recent years by the economic and financial crisis, which also hit these countries to some extent. I would say at the beginning, yes. In the first decade of transformation after 1989, 1990, it was certainly the social dimension of system change which played an important role on the electoral market. And to some extent, this explains the success of post-communist successor parties in the early 1990s, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, elsewhere, but also a broader left turn, which we were observing in some countries of the region. I think this social dimension, or the socio-economic populism, maintained up to the middle of the last decade. I think the Polish elections 2005, which brought the victory of the Kaczynski party, Right and Justice, was very much about social issues, about Solidarna Polska, not so much about anti-German or anti-EU effects. because I think in Poland you lose elections playing with the German card or with the European card. So it was very much a sort of framing the debate, the elections, parliamentary and presidential, as a choice between an egotistic, market liberal Poland of Tusk and a more solidaristic one of the Kaczynskis, and at that time they were successful. I think also Fidesz, at that time, when Fidesz lost the elections in 2006, still was in this Solidarność Magyarország period where they tried to copy, in some respect, the Kaczynskis, and Viktor Orban was a plebeian rather than someone who wants to build a new middle class. But I think later on, this kind of social dimension was channeled and segmented. Certainly there is a stable constituency of the periphery, of the downside of reforms, and they very often have a certain inclination to these challenging parties. But we should not forget that the losers of transformation very often do not vote at all. I think one should do much more research about the question, who is benefiting from a high and low voter turnout? Common wisdom is that low voter turnout is beneficial to populist groups. I doubt about that. We should at least look closer at that. Also, if you look at the effects of the financial crisis, there is no clear picture in this region. Very interesting example is Latvia, where we had a really terrible effect of the crisis with double-digit negative growth, high unemployment, austerity, and so on and so forth. But basically, Dombrovskis' government was, or Dombrovskis of the center-right austerity government was confirmed. And the only success of a rather far-right populist group, All Latvia, came in 2011 when the economy already had begun to restart again, but not in the deep downturn phase. So it's rather kind of an unclear picture on the socioeconomic drivers. The second reason, which might be behind the success of populist parties, is what I always call the political economy of time. So I think if people in these countries have a prospect of convergence, they are more or less satisfied with their governments. However, if the gap between macroeconomic convergence, between the country performance and the individual experience is too big, this creates frustration. And I think 2004 symbolically marked a point in time when people said, now we have entered the affluent part of Europe, but we ourselves, as individuals, we are not rich. So the permissive consensus vis-à-vis the elites to do reform programs expired. People said, so we were ready to accept the implementation of reforms, but now we want the payback, we want the effects, and big parts of the societies were not able to earn or to grab the fruit of reform. Then the third element, which to some extent has something to do with this kind of impatience and political economy of time, of course, during the first period of especially successful implementation of reforms, the political space narrowed substantially. So the successful consensus of elites to bring countries closer, especially to the European Union, to push through the economic reform packages, meant a reform mantra. And as someone from Hungary, Fodor Gábor, once called it, to a technocratic nihilism. So the political space narrowed increasingly, And then came the challengers, especially after 2004, and had new offers and the prospect of choice in terms of identity politics, in terms of economic strategies. And that's why they said, so the time of, that's what I think the intellectual fellows of the Kaczynskis in Poland say clearly, the time of imitating the West is over. It's not only over, it was a mistake. So they say, and to some extent I think they're correct, they said the liberal pro-Western reform elite started from an inferiority complex. We are the worst West, and we have to copy and paste the models in terms of economy, state, but also of values. And we should have something different, taking into account our own experience and our own situation. And I think this is, to some extent, what we're still witnessing in some cases, for example in Hungary, kind of the crusade against the forces of globalization, the gazdasági szabadságharc, so the fight for economic freedom, unorthodox economic policies, something where we need a certain autonomy from the world around us in order to go down our own path. And the fourth element, which is behind the rise of challenging parties, and I think this is the most powerful one and the most important one, no doubt, that is the rising, as someone called it, distrust and disgust with the political elites. So I think the broad thrust of challenging and contesting parties in the last years in this part of Europe, and not only there but also especially here, is directed against what we already heard, clientelism, corrupt networks. Some people say it's mainly anti-corruption single-issue parties, which were the most successful one in Central Eastern Europe in the last years and last waves of elections. So to some extent, the gaining ground of populist forces is, I would call it, a rebellion against the occupation of the state and the colonialization of a very soft state. And an insurrection against networks. So the big turnarounds, which were very spectacular some years ago, Poland 2004, Hungary 2010, they emerged after big corruption affairs which were at the center of the public debate in these countries. The Rivin case in Poland, the Starachowice case in Poland, and the implosion of the center-left which to some extent was involved into them. Same story in Hungary, and even in a country like Latvia, in the last elections, the oligarchs' parties were punished. So I think this is the most important, looking at these four bunches of determinants of reasons. So all in all, I would say it's very much about the broken promises of transformation, and the ability of challenging parties to offer a rupture, a new beginning, and calling for the continuation or what they call a real transformation. I think this is Orban's narrative. So the transformation didn't really go on in Hungary. It kind of ended up in the sands somewhere in the 1990s. So we have to continue where we kind of ended up in the early 1990s. So now I'll be more briefly. After the reasons, the question is now who is attracted by such groups and leaders. To be very short, I would say we have three social strata, social segments for whom those groups are interesting. Of course, as mentioned earlier, it's the losers of reforms, with this kind of limitation that they are very often apathic and that they're not, that they rather are opting for the exit than for the voice option if they're not satisfied with the political situation. Second, and I think this is very important, I would call it the would-be middle classes. So, of course, we have, at least in the more successful countries of the region, the emergence of the new urban middle classes everywhere, the open-minded, liberal, pro-European, well-educated, but we also have the kind of what in Western Europe we would call the lower middle class or the middle class. And here, people working in the public sphere, for example, they have no real chance to do this step which the successful modernizing urban middle classes have done, and they are frustrated by that. And the third group, which is maybe in quantitative terms not as important as not yet highly important, but qualitatively it might have an impact. These are the graduates without prospects. So the younger people having invested a lot in education, but having no real prospects on the labor markets. And either they're leaving the country or they try to engage in some way within the countries. Not necessarily with the populists, but it is also possible that they do it. So a big kind of group of politically homeless persons, plus what we all know, the high degree of volatility, of course, is beneficial to political new starters and challenging parties. Now, third, maybe we should have done this at the very beginning, the offer and the supply. Who are the populists and what are the promises? My observation is that as opposed to Western Europe, populism in the younger democracies in the eastern part of Europe is a much more heterogeneous and colorful phenomenon. So whereas in Western Europe, the debate about populism and research about populism since the 1970s, 80s was very much focused on right-wing nationalist populism, in Central Europe we have a very broad array of animals, of populist animals. So I think some have been more agrarian, some have been more social, some have been in their the combination of their populist approach and style with a certain kind of issue orientation. Some have been more nationalist, of course, and they have been populists of the center from the very beginning. So it was a multitude of populist groups or currents. Now, a more recent development, and I think this is very important, also telling for Western Europe, it's even more blurred. And the successful new parties of the last elections, or the elections in the last 4, 5, or 6 years, they are very much centered around the corruption issue. Someone has called them anti-establishment reform parties. And that's groups like Pozitivna Slovenia in Slovenia, or Viran's Citizens List. That's groups like Mr. Matovic and the Common People in Slovakia. That's groups like Zatler's Reform Party in Latvia. Many of them, also an interesting feature, are highly personalized. Even in the name of the parties, you have the name of the leader. So the Reform Party in Latvia originally was called Zatler's Reform Party, or Viran's Citizen List, or the movement of Palikot in Poland, which is a more center-left, maybe, variant of this. So I think these groups, and certainly also some of them here in this country, belong to this category. The public affairs, for example, maybe ANO. So these groups, coming from the middle, they are the most successful and most dynamic ones. And at least, also Borisov in Romania, I think, is Gerb and his party. The Borisov's party, Gerb, would belong to this. In some cases, they are very much kind of looking at who votes for these groups. They are very much representing the average of society. So they do not come from the fringes, but it's the average. They are highly representative. So I would say, where do we stand now? This is the third wave of a mobilization of embitterment in Central Europe. So the first one was the ex-communist parties gaining ground in the early 1990s. Then people saw, we voted for them in order to have a social turn, but unfortunately many of these parties did what was very good for the countries because they implemented the reform packages in Poland or in Hungary, but it was not really appropriate to the expectations of their voters. And people turned away from them. Then came the second wave, post-accession fatigue, Kaczynski and others. And now I think that's a broader sort of disappointment about the lack of responsiveness of the political class. So what comes out from that? What is the message? And that's my final remark. Three things are important also for the future debate about what is happening in Western Europe. First, the populist scenery is more and more fuzzy and fluid. It's not only the bad guys from the far right. They come from very different parts of the political scenery. They have no clear face, apart from their appeal, corruption is bad, the elite is bad. So they're rather kind of, very often they're rather centripetal than centrifugal. The second observation, it is one which I already made 5 or 6 years ago, and I think this still is true. The soft populists are more important and more dangerous, a bigger challenge than the hardcore populists from the far right or far left. So the extremist right in the Central European countries is stagnating, basically. We have Jobbik in Hungary, that's true, but apart from that, there are only a few exceptions. Ataka in Bulgaria, maybe. But elsewhere, populist parties have lost ground. They even did not manage to gain parliamentary representation. So it's rather the borderliners, the modest populists, which can gain majorities. And the third thing, what I already said, populists are more and more catch-all. So they are not, they do not come from the fringes and from the underprivileged margins of society, but also from the heart of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kai-Olaf. In principle, we are very short in time, and I don't want to start the first panel with a delay, but there's one question we really should discuss, because, Tanja, you said that these right-wing popular parties with their anti-immigration policies have detrimental consequences to established parties and to the whole political system. And Kai said these populist parties are a corrective because they take up issues that were neglected. We need a discussion.
Sorry, you will laugh, but that right-wing populist parties may be positive corrected was exactly the starting point of my investigations. But I was thinking, for example, all these anti-establishment things could make political elites move to reform a democracy. But what I found was that they try to instrumentalize and that they try to preserve their power, and that right-wing populist parties are doing exactly the same when they are in power. So there is no such, the responsiveness increases. Yeah, they took up the issues about immigration, they took up the issues of political reforms, but what comes out in the end is not coherent with responsibility for democracy or accountability in democracy. So, yeah, I hoped it could be that it's more positive.
If mainstream parties are not able to regain the discursive hegemony, that's not the mistake of the populists. So, I'm not talking about my personal political preferences, but from an analytical point of view, they do not deserve to have a majority if they're not able to convince the majority of societies that issue A has to be tackled in this or the other way. Of course, there are some red lines, which certainly should be shared by all participants of the political process. And it's a question, what is a taboo? I mean, populists try to de-tabooize. Yeah? And to some extent it's good, but there should be a consensus about what should not be, what should remain a taboo.
But I think it's not the case in Eastern Europe. The success of Orbán Viktor is due to the fact that he combined the national populism with social populism. Until that time, there was a division of labor. Right-wing parties were populist in national issues, and left-wing parties were populist in social issues. And just Orbán kicked off this so-called agreement, and he combined the two of that. And if we follow the different surveys on value structures of the societies in Eastern Europe, we see that they can respond to these things. So, but to the needs of populism. But the populistic parties, and it's not good to mix it. That of course they reflect existing problems such as the economic crisis, disillusionment, corruption of the political elite, etc., etc. But it does not give a response. So when we are judging what is the merit of Orbán Viktor's government, nothing. His merit is having an Azerbaijan, having a Belarus within the EU. And you have to be very aware of the fact that if once Kaczynski would have two-thirds majority here, or Ponta would have a two-thirds majority in Romania, or Basescu would have a two-thirds majority in Romania as well, they would create very similar regimes. It's a virus. It's a virus. Two-thirds majority means that they can freely create a constitution. They can change the personal leadership of all institutions, which are the institutions of checks and balances, from the president of the country, the chief attorney, the members of the constitutional court, the head of the courts, etc., etc. And then the political cleansing is started. The novelty of this regime, that it's not a classic dictatorship, what will happen here, which is not a classic dictatorship in Azerbaijan or in Turkmenistan. Why I'm speaking about a mafia state? Because it's a combination of concentration of political power and personal wealth. And the ruling elite is built up under different principles. When we were speaking about, there is no nomenclatura in the classic communist sense. It's just different families belonging to this network and adopted political family of the whole structure of the new ruling elite. And we are seeking it that Kai-Olaf mentioned, the three losers strata in Eastern societies. One of the losers of the regime change. What if Viktor Orbán makes now? just demobilize them, practically tries to make it impossible for them to unite, to express their ideas, etc., etc., with the restriction and manipulation of the election law, with the restriction of the freedom of press, etc. Middle classes, it's just a catchword. We do not have at all. We have vassals. We have vassals, and that stability, what it promises, that those who are belonging to us, even personally on a family base, practically, they can get state tenders. They can gain state tenders. The biggest company now in Hungary is so-called Közgép. Last year in 2013, had €1.5 billion. They won €1.5 billion worth tender in Hungary. Practically, and half of them, they were the only runners, because everybody knew that it has no sense to run where Közgép is there. And this is, his leader is the friend of Orbán Viktor, with whom they shared a room in the college, in the student hostel for years. So the middle classes are just not, excuse me, that's not the middle classes of autonomous people like in a Western term of classes. It's a new system of vassals. And the third social stratum of losers, the graduates without perspective. Yes, in the last few years, more than 300,000 people left Hungary going outside, and they were not tomato pickers. They were mainly intellectuals, and now they are practically excluded from the possibility of voting now in the 6th of April and the elections. So when a populist ideology is referring to these problems, of course they can build their autocratic power.
Okay, thank you. Just 2 words because we are short on time.
I agree to many things what Bálint said, many criticisms, but I disagree in one respect. I think Orbán's Hungary is definitely not Belarus. Yeah, it's, I would call it it's not Belarus. It's not Belarus. It's not. I think it is a system of antagonistic majoritarian democracy. The British called this once an electoral dictatorship. The problem is maybe that we don't have British in Hungary. Just the last thing, what we should at a later stage discuss is what is the role of the societies and the electorates in that. And maybe, I mean, that's an open question for me. There are 2 theses. I think Havel at some point said, societies in Central and Eastern Europe have an instinctive attitude against, an instinctive resistance against authoritarianism because they kind of had to fight for their freedom after 1989. And the counter argument is the societies are more prone to authoritarian democracies. The truth is certainly somewhere in between, but we also see Bulgaria, where people have protested against the oligarchs and so on and so forth. We even see it in Ukraine, where we also have parts in a country where the civil society is weaker and so on and so forth, where parts of the mobilized society have fought highly corrupt structures. So what is the role of societies in this part of Europe?
Thank you. I won't have any more questions and no more discussion because it's very late and we have 2 keynote speeches in virtually 5 minutes. So thank you very much and see you later on the next panel.